In the early hours of December 7th, 1941, the world shifted. At 7:55 a.m., waves of Japanese aircraft roared over the calm waters of Oahu and descended upon the American Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Within minutes, torpedoes ripped through battleships, bombs ignited fuel depots, and smoke swallowed the sky. More than 2,400 Americans were killed that morning. The attack, planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific before it could interfere with Japan's expansion. But instead of breaking American resolve, it ignited it. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Across America, young men lined up to enlist. Among them were thousands who would soon wear the uniform of the United States Marine Corps. At the time, the Marines were a relatively small force compared to the Army, yet they carried a long tradition of amphibious warfare and expeditionary combat. Their doctrine emphasized speed, aggression, and adaptability, qualities that would soon define the Pacific War. Meanwhile, Japan's military leadership believed it possessed a decisive advantage. For decades, Imperial Japan had built a hardened, disciplined fighting force shaped by a warrior code rooted in Bushido, the way of the warrior. Honor, loyalty to the emperor, and death before surrender were not abstract ideals, they were expectations. Soldiers were taught that surrender was dishonorable, even unthinkable. This mindset had already proven effective. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They captured Hong Kong, invaded Malaya, and forced the surrender of Singapore. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops fought desperately on Bataan and Corregidor before eventually being overwhelmed. The Japanese military appeared unstoppable. Many Japanese officers viewed American forces as soft, industrial, wealthy, but lacking spiritual endurance. They believed Americans relied too heavily on machines and comfort. The assumption was simple. In a prolonged, brutal struggle, Japan's warrior spirit would prevail. But this belief would soon be tested. In early 1942, as Japan consolidated its defensive ring across thousands of miles of ocean, the United States began mobilizing at an unprecedented scale. Factories converted overnight to wartime production. Ships, aircraft, and weapons poured from assembly lines. The industrial might of America began to awaken. Yet victory in the Pacific would not be decided by factories alone. It would be decided on beaches, in jungles, and on volcanic islands where men fought face to face. The Marines trained relentlessly. Recruits endured grueling conditioning, live fire exercises, and amphibious landing drills. They were taught to move under fire, to dig in quickly, and to advance no matter the resistance. Instructors hammered one message into them: complete the mission. By mid-1942, Japan sought to extend its defensive ring further into the Pacific, aiming to isolate Australia and threaten American supply lines. This ambition led to the critical confrontation at Midway. In June 1942, U.S. naval forces dealt Japan a devastating blow at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The battle marked a strategic turning point. For the first time, Japan's expansion had been halted. But the struggle was far from over. The vast Pacific theater was unlike anything American forces had faced before. It stretched across thousands of islands, many little more than specks of jungle-covered land surrounded by coral reefs. Each island could become a fortress. Each landing would require precision, courage, and endurance. Japanese defensive strategy evolved as well. Rather than meeting attackers at the shoreline, they began preparing layered defenses inland, bunkers, tunnels, hidden artillery. Soldiers were ordered to fight to the last man. Retreat was shameful. Capture was disgrace. In this environment, brutality escalated quickly. American Marines soon discovered that surrender was rare. Even when surrounded, Japanese units often launched sudden nighttime assaults, what Americans came to call banzai charges. The fighting was close, chaotic, and merciless. Flamethrowers, grenades, bayonets. Combat in the Pacific was intimate and unforgiving. At the same time, Japanese troops began encountering something unexpected. The Marines did not break. Despite casualties, disease, heat, and exhaustion, they kept advancing. When pinned down, they reorganized. When leaders fell, others stepped forward. Naval artillery and air support were coordinated with growing precision. Every assault was backed by overwhelming firepower and relentless pressure. What Japanese commanders had dismissed as soft was in fact something else entirely: industrial power combined with disciplined aggression. The clash was not just military, it was psychological. On one side stood soldiers conditioned to prefer death over surrender. On the other stood Marines trained to adapt, absorb punishment, and continue advancing no matter the cost. Each battle eroded assumptions. Each engagement reshaped perceptions. By the end of 1942, the war in the Pacific had transformed from a rapid Japanese expansion to a grinding struggle for survival and dominance. The stage was set for some of the fiercest fighting of World War II. And as the months unfolded, Japanese soldiers would begin to speak of the Marines in new terms, not merely as enemies, but as relentless opponents who would not yield. The fear did not appear overnight. It was forged in the fires of the islands yet to come. August 7th, 1942. Before dawn, American warships opened fire on a little-known island in the Solomon Chain. The target was Guadalcanal. What followed would become one of the most important and brutal campaigns of the Pacific War, the Battle of Guadalcanal. For the first time, American forces, led primarily by the United States Marine Corps, went on the offensive against Japanese-held territory. The objective was simple in theory: seize an unfinished Japanese airfield that threatened Allied supply routes between the United States and Australia. In practice, it would become a 6-month nightmare of jungle warfare, naval battles, starvation, disease, and relentless close combat. When the 1st Marine Division landed, resistance at the beaches was lighter than expected. The Marines quickly captured the airfield, later naming it Henderson Field. But the Japanese were not retreating. They were preparing to counterattack. Guadalcanal was not just another island, it was a test of endurance. The jungle swallowed sound and light. Heat and humidity drained strength from even the fittest men. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections spread rapidly. Supplies were limited. At times, Marines survived on reduced rations, uncertain when reinforcements would arrive. And at night, the real terror began. Japanese forces, many of them seasoned veterans, moved silently through the jungle. They attacked in coordinated nighttime assaults, often charging directly into Marine defensive lines. Screams, gunfire, and explosions shattered the darkness. Flares lit the sky as Marines fired into waves of advancing soldiers. One of the earliest major counterattacks was at the Battle of the Tarawa River. Japanese commanders underestimated the American defenses, believing a sudden frontal assault would overwhelm them. Instead, Marine machine guns and artillery tore through the attacking force. The result was devastating for the Japanese unit. Yet the fighting did not stop. In September 1942, another major attack targeted a ridge south of Henderson Field. Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson and his raiders held their position through repeated assaults in what became known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge. The Marines were outnumbered, exhausted, and under constant pressure, but they did not break. They repositioned, they counterattacked, they held. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to rapid victories across Southeast Asia, Guadalcanal was different. The enemy did not collapse under pressure. The Marines absorbed shock and responded with disciplined firepower. Meanwhile, the battle extended beyond the jungle. Naval clashes erupted in the surrounding waters. Warships dueled in the dark during what became known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Japanese destroyers attempted to deliver reinforcements in nighttime runs dubbed the Tokyo Express, but American resistance stiffened with each passing week. On land, the struggle grew more desperate. Food shortages became severe for Japanese troops. Malnutrition and disease weakened entire units. Yet orders remained clear: fight to the end. Retreat was dishonorable. Marine units, though also suffering, benefited from improving logistics and growing air superiority. Aircraft operating from Henderson Field, nicknamed the Cactus Air Force, intercepted Japanese bombers and disrupted supply efforts. The psychological balance began to shift. Japanese soldiers had been told that Americans lacked spiritual strength, that they would retreat in the face of hardship. But on Guadalcanal, Marines dug deeper. When one position was overrun, they established another. When ammunition ran low, they redistributed what remained. Junior leaders stepped up as casualties mounted. Reports filtered back through Japanese ranks describing American defenders who seemed relentless, men who fought stubbornly even when surrounded. By November 1942, it was clear that the campaign was turning. Reinforced American units pushed outward from Henderson Field, tightening control over the island. Japanese attempts to retake the airfield failed repeatedly, each assault costing irreplaceable veterans. Finally, in February 1943, Japanese command made a rare decision: evacuation. Under cover of darkness, remaining troops were withdrawn from Guadalcanal. It was the first major land defeat for Japan in the Pacific War. The cost had been staggering on both sides. Thousands were dead, many more were wounded or permanently scarred. But something fundamental had changed. Guadalcanal proved that Japan's advance could be stopped and reversed. For the Marines, it forged a hardened identity. They had endured months of isolation, relentless attacks, hunger, and disease. They had fought an enemy who refused surrender and attacked without hesitation, and they had prevailed. For Japanese soldiers, Guadalcanal planted the first seeds of a new perception. The Americans, especially the Marines, were not soft. They were organized, adaptable, and unyielding. They combined industrial firepower with determined infantry assault. They did not retreat easily, and once they landed, they did not give up ground. The reputation of the Marine as a relentless fighter was not born from propaganda. It was earned in the mud, blood, and darkness of Guadalcanal, and it was only the beginning. By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new and far more brutal phase. After Guadalcanal, American commanders adopted a strategy known as island hopping, bypassing some Japanese strongholds while seizing others that could serve as forward bases. Each target, however, was heavily defended, and each landing would test the limits of human endurance. In November 1943, U.S. forces struck a tiny coral atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The objective was strategic: secure an airfield and open the path toward the Marshall Islands. The name of that battle would become synonymous with shock and bloodshed: the Battle of Tarawa. Tarawa was small, barely 2 miles long, but it was transformed into a fortress. Japanese defenders constructed reinforced bunkers, concrete pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire, and artillery positions carefully zeroed in on the beaches. Barbed wire and log barricades lined the shoreline. They were prepared to fight to the last man. When the Marines approached on November 20, 1943, things immediately went wrong. Low tides exposed coral reefs that landing craft could not cross. Hundreds of Marines were forced to disembark far from shore and wade through chest-deep water under direct machine gun and artillery fire. The lagoon turned red. Radios failed. Units became disorganized. But they kept moving. Pinned against a narrow strip of sand with minimal cover, Marines clawed forward yard by yard. Flamethrowers were used to clear bunkers. Demolition teams crawled forward with explosives. Tanks that managed to reach shore became moving shields for infantry. For Japanese defenders, this resistance was staggering. They had expected enormous casualties to break the assault. Instead, despite horrific losses in the first hours, the Marines reorganized and pressed inland. Small unit leadership proved decisive. When officers fell, sergeants took command. When communications collapsed, squads acted independently. After 3 days of close-quarters combat, Tarawa was secured. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison was killed. Of roughly 4,500 defenders, only a handful survived. The cost to the Marines was over 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in just 76 hours. Tarawa sent a powerful message to both sides. For Americans, it revealed the true cost of amphibious assault against fortified islands. For Japan, it demonstrated something deeply troubling. Even the strongest defensive preparations could not stop determined Marine assaults supported by overwhelming firepower. Yet the worst was still ahead. In June 1944, American forces targeted the Mariana Islands. Among them was Saipan, a strategically vital island that would allow U.S. bombers to reach the Japanese home islands. The battle that followed, the Battle of Saipan, would become one of the most ferocious confrontations of the war. Unlike earlier battles, Saipan was larger, more complex, and defended by over 30,000 Japanese troops. This time, Japanese commanders adopted new tactics. Rather than massing forces at the beaches, they built deep defensive networks in hills and caves. Artillery was hidden in mountainsides. Supplies were stockpiled underground. The Marines landed under heavy fire but pushed inland methodically. What they encountered was a new form of warfare, cave fighting. Japanese soldiers used tunnels to move unseen between positions. A bunker cleared in the morning might be reoccupied by nightfall. Snipers hid in rocky outcroppings. Machine gun nests were concealed behind thick concrete and sand. To dislodge defenders, Marines relied heavily on flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition charges. Combat became intimate and merciless. Fighting often occurred within yards, sometimes feet, of the enemy. For Japanese troops, surrender was not an option. Orders were explicit: fight to the last cartridge. In July 1944, as American forces compressed Japanese lines on Saipan, one of the largest banzai charges of the war erupted. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many already wounded, launched a massive nighttime assault against American positions. The attack crashed into Marine and Army lines in chaotic waves. Hand-to-hand combat followed. Bayonets, rifle butts, and entrenching tools were used in the darkness. By dawn, the field was covered with fallen attackers. The scale of destruction was overwhelming. Saipan ultimately fell after weeks of brutal fighting. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. The island's fall had enormous strategic consequences. It placed American B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. But beyond strategy, something else had taken shape. Japanese soldiers had witnessed repeated assaults where Marines advanced despite artillery barrages, despite fortified caves, despite suicidal counterattacks. Even when pinned down, they regrouped. Even when facing near certain death, they pressed forward. The psychological shift deepened. American amphibious assaults were no longer viewed as temporary incursions. Once the Marines landed, they stayed. They built airstrips, they brought reinforcements, they absorbed losses and continued advancing with calculated force. The combination of naval bombardment, close air support, and aggressive infantry tactics created a relentless rhythm. Bombard, land, advance, destroy resistance, repeat. For Japanese defenders conditioned to believe in spiritual superiority, these battles were sobering. Courage alone could not repel artillery. Honor alone could not stop flamethrowers clearing caves. The myth of American weakness was collapsing under the weight of reality. Island by island, the Marines refined their tactics. They improved coordination. They adapted to terrain. They anticipated ambushes. Each battle became a grim lesson applied to the next landing. By the end of 1944, the pattern was clear. Japanese soldiers knew that if Marines were sighted offshore, a storm was coming, one that would not subside until every bunker was silenced. The Pacific War had transformed into a grinding, merciless advance toward Japan itself, and the fear that began as doubt at Guadalcanal had evolved into something far more concrete. The Marines were not simply persistent, they were unstoppable once committed. And the islands ahead would prove it beyond any doubt.
By 1944, Japanese soldiers no longer underestimated the Americans landing on their shores. But what many still struggled to understand was why the Marines kept advancing, no matter the terrain, no matter the losses. The answer did not begin on the beaches of the Pacific. It began in boot camp. Every Marine passed through brutal physical and mental conditioning. Recruits were stripped of civilian identity and rebuilt into disciplined infantrymen. Long marches with full gear, live fire exercises, bayonet drills, amphibious landings under simulated fire. Training was designed to exhaust, harden, and unify. Instructors taught a simple principle: accomplish the mission. There was no room for hesitation. Unlike larger formations, Marine units emphasized small unit leadership. Corporals and sergeants were trained to make decisions independently. If officers fell, the chain of command did not collapse. Initiative was expected. Adaptability was mandatory. This structure became crucial in the Pacific, where communication often failed under fire. But training alone did not explain the Marines' battlefield reputation. Another factor was coordination. By 1944, amphibious assault had evolved into a precise combined arms operation. Naval bombardment would soften defenses. Aircraft would strike artillery and supply points. Then landing craft would surge toward shore. Once ashore, infantry, tanks, engineers, and flamethrower teams worked in concert. Japanese defenders had prepared for courage-driven frontal assaults. What they faced instead was methodical destruction. Before a single Marine stepped onto a beach, warships could pound defensive positions for hours. Carrier-based aircraft strafed and bombed bunkers. Even so, Japanese positions were often deeply fortified and hidden within caves. This forced Marines to adapt constantly. On islands like Peleliu, Marines discovered that surface bombardment often failed to destroy underground tunnel systems. Japanese soldiers could wait out artillery strikes and re-emerge once the shelling stopped. The solution was close combat. Flamethrower operators became some of the most feared figures on the battlefield. Protected by riflemen, They advanced toward cave openings, unleashing fire that consumed oxygen and forced defenders out, or ended resistance inside. Demolition teams followed, sealing tunnels with explosives. The fighting was brutal and personal. For Japanese soldiers raised under Bushido, the code emphasizing honor and sacrifice, the refusal to surrender remained absolute. Many chose death rather than capture. But what increasingly unsettled them was not just Marine firepower. It was Marine persistence. If an attack stalled, Marines did not retreat permanently. They regrouped. They called in additional artillery. They flanked positions. They attacked again at dawn. And if necessary, they attacked again the next day. This relentless tempo wore down defenders physically and psychologically. Equally powerful was the bond between Marines. Shared hardship forged intense loyalty. Men who survived Guadalcanal carried lessons to Tarawa. Veterans mentored replacements. Units developed deep cohesion through shared loss and shared survival. Letters home often spoke of exhaustion and fear, but also of determination not to let down the men fighting beside them. That sense of brotherhood became a weapon of its own. Japanese intelligence reports began noting that Marine units showed unusual resilience even after heavy casualties. Wounded Marines were quickly replaced. Command structures reformed almost instantly. Defensive lines bent but rarely shattered. Industrial power supported this resilience. The United States produced ships, ammunition, vehicles, and aircraft at staggering rates. Damaged equipment was replaced. Reinforcements arrived continuously. Supply chains stretched across the Pacific, delivering food, medicine, and ammunition in quantities Japan struggled to match. For Japanese defenders, isolation grew worse with each passing month. Food shortages intensified. Ammunition became scarce. Air superiority increasingly favored the Americans. Meanwhile, Marines landed with fresh supplies, armored vehicles, and coordinated air support. The psychological balance shifted further. Stories circulated among Japanese ranks describing Marines who kept advancing under machine gun fire, of units that returned after failed assaults with heavier bombardment, of flamethrowers clearing caves that had been considered impenetrable. The myth of American fragility had vanished. In its place stood a new reality, an enemy trained to adapt, supported by overwhelming logistics and driven by unit loyalty rather than individual glory. Even the Marine ethos reinforced this identity. The concept of semper fidelis, always faithful, was not merely a motto. It reflected loyalty to mission and to fellow Marines. This translated into battlefield behavior that appeared unbreakable from the outside. Japanese soldiers still fought fiercely. Their courage remained unquestioned, but increasingly they faced an opponent whose strength was not rooted in ideology alone. It was rooted in preparation, in discipline, in coordination, in industrial backing, and in the unspoken promise between Marines that no one would advance or fall alone. By late 1944, as American forces moved ever closer to Japan's inner defensive ring, the question for Japanese commanders was no longer whether the Marines could be stopped on a beach. It was how long any island could hold once they arrived. The Marine reputation had evolved beyond simple toughness. It had become synonymous with inevitability. And the final battles of the Pacific would test that reputation under the harshest conditions imaginable.
By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached Japan's inner defensive perimeter. There were no illusions left on either side. Japanese commanders understood that the Americans were coming closer to the home islands. The next battles would not be distant outposts, they would be shields protecting Japan itself. And for the Marines, these final assaults would become the ultimate test of everything they had learned. In February 1945, American forces targeted a small volcanic island roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. Its name was Iwo Jima. The battle that followed, the Battle of Iwo Jima, would become one of the most iconic and devastating confrontations of World War II. Iwo Jima was only 8 square miles in size, but it was transformed into a fortress. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi abandoned the traditional tactic of defending the beaches. Instead, he constructed an elaborate network of underground tunnels, bunkers, artillery positions, and hidden strongpoints carved into rock and reinforced with concrete. There would be no mass banzai charges at the shoreline. There would be attrition. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they faced something unlike any previous invasion. The black volcanic sand made movement exhausting. Vehicles became stuck. There was almost no natural cover. And for the first hour, Japanese guns remained largely silent. Then the bombardment began. Artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions. The island itself seemed to fire back. Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano dominating the southern end, hid heavy guns inside its slopes. The Marines pushed forward anyway. Flamethrowers and demolition teams once again became essential. Every bunker had to be cleared individually. Every tunnel entrance had to be sealed. Japanese defenders fought from hidden chambers, emerging unexpectedly through underground passageways. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties mounted rapidly. Entire platoons were pinned down. Communications broke. Yet the assault did not stop. Reinforcements landed continuously. Naval guns offshore provided relentless support. Aircraft roared overhead. On February 23rd, Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. There, they raised the American flag, an image later immortalized in one of the most famous photographs of the war. But the battle was far from over. For weeks, fighting continued across the northern half of the island. Japanese soldiers, cut off from resupply and under orders not to surrender, resisted from caves and tunnels. Many fought to the death. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive. Marine casualties were staggering, over 6,800 killed and nearly 20,000 wounded. Iwo Jima demonstrated something chillingly clear. Even against the most fortified positions, the Marines would continue advancing until resistance was extinguished. But the final and bloodiest chapter of the Pacific War still awaited. In April 1945, Allied forces invaded Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. The Battle of Okinawa would last nearly 3 months and become one of the deadliest battles of the entire war. Okinawa was strategically vital, close enough to serve as a staging ground for a potential invasion of mainland Japan. Japanese defenders prepared accordingly. Like Iwo Jima, they abandoned beach defense in favor of layered inland fortifications. Hills were honeycombed with tunnels, artillery was hidden in ridgelines, defensive lines were anchored around natural terrain features such as the Shiri Line. When Marines and Army units landed on April 1st, initial resistance was surprisingly light, but as forces advanced southward, they encountered deeply entrenched defenses. Rain turned battlefields into mud. Visibility was often limited. Every ridge concealed machine guns. Every cave could hide a sniper. And above the battlefield, a new threat emerged. Kamikaze pilots launched coordinated suicide attacks against Allied ships offshore. Hundreds of aircraft crashed into destroyers, carriers, and transport ships. The sea itself became a battlefield of fire and wreckage. On land, the fighting was relentless. Japanese troops launched night infiltrations. Mortar fire rained down on forward positions. American units assaulted fortified ridges under constant artillery bombardment. Flamethrowers and explosives were again used to clear underground networks. The scale of destruction was immense. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Entire villages were destroyed. Both sides suffered catastrophic casualties. By the battle's end, over 12,000 Americans were dead, including thousands of Marines. Japanese military deaths exceeded 90,000. Yet, despite the horror, the pattern remained. When faced with fortified ridges, Marines adapted. When pinned down, they coordinated artillery and air support. When repulsed, they reorganized and attacked again. Japanese soldiers fought with extraordinary determination, but they could not reverse the momentum. By June 1945, organized resistance on Okinawa collapsed. The psychological impact of these final battles was profound. Japanese commanders recognized that if the mainland were invaded, the cost would be catastrophic for both sides. American planners, too, saw the staggering casualties and understood what an invasion of Japan might demand. But for the Marines, Iwo Jima and Okinawa cemented a legacy forged across the Pacific. They had stormed beaches under machine gun fire. They had cleared tunnels in suffocating darkness. They had endured artillery, snipers, kamikazes, disease, and exhaustion. And they had kept advancing. By the war's final months, Japanese soldiers no longer underestimated them. The fear was not rooted in myth. It was born from repeated experience. Once the Marines landed, they did not withdraw. They did not collapse under counterattack. They adapted. They reinforced. They returned. Island by island, ridge by ridge, bunker by bunker, they pushed forward until resistance ended. When the war concluded in August 1945, after the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender, the Pacific battlefield fell silent. But the reputation forged there endured, not as legend alone, but as the hard-earned result of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless determination under some of the harshest combat conditions in modern history. And in the memories of those who faced them, one truth remained unmistakable. The U.S. Marines were an enemy that did not stop.